So today we begin the first lesson of our very last unit in grade 12 biology, and that is homeostasis. And so we're going to get there, but I want to give you a few quick examples of situations that involve and require homeostasis in order for us to survive. So the first example is, we look at blood sugar. So our blood sugar, no matter what, the concentration of sugar in our blood remains at about 0.1%, although our food hardly ever contains this sugar content. Our blood pH stays at about a level of 7.35, which is just a little bit on the alkaline side of normal, even though we can consume tons of acidic food, right? So like vinaigrette on a salad, for example. And if our blood pH levels go outside that range, too far outside that range, we die. So why is it that despite the fact that we're eating foods of various pH levels, that our blood pH tends to remain in and around 7.35? Well, the reality is that we have several different mechanisms in place to maintain that internal environment at a constant level, despite all these other changes that might be occurring inside the body. So, and one good example of this to explain blood pH is the buffer system, which you may remember we touched on in the first unit. And essentially, the buffer system is what enables a constant environment within our bloodstream, more or less, right? So what is homeostasis? Homeostasis is that process of maintaining that internal balance, whether we're talking about blood glucose levels, whether we're talking about blood pH levels, or any other process within the body that needs to be sort of maintained at a constant level. So the focus of this unit is going to be to explain some of the mechanisms by which our body is able to maintain that constant internal environment. So just to quickly get back to this blood pH level, if we look at the left portion of this equation, we can see that this is symbolizing the input of extra hydrogen ions, that acidic ion, into the bloodstream. And so the bicarbonate buffer system within our body takes those extra hydrogen ions and combines them with bicarbonate ions in the blood to form carbonic acid. Now, luckily for us, carbonic acid will dissociate, but it won't dissociate back into the acid ion. It'll dissociate to form carbon dioxide molecules, and of course our respiratory system is able to expel our carbon dioxide as waste. And so that's an example of how our blood pH is able to, generally speaking, stay within a certain range. So all homeostatic control systems have three basic components, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit on this, but I want you to think about it sort of like how this thermostat in your house works to maintain a constant temperature. And just think about that name, thermostat. Thermo meaning heat, static, or stationary. In our body, we're going to have a sensor, so some kind of something in our body's environment that will detect that there's something going on between the acceptable normal limits. We're going to have something that's actually going to coordinate a response, and that we call the integrator. So the integrator is going to be responsible for taking the information from the sensor and relaying it to the component that's going to actually do something about it. And so the effector is what we call that response. And basically the effector is going to cause a response that's going to restore homeostatic static balance, bring things back to the quote-unquote normal way of being. So let's take a quick look at how all of these components are going to work together. So remember, again, we have our sensor, we have our integrator, and we have our effector. So our sensor, or our receptor sensors, they're calling it in this diagram, if we're thinking about the example of the thermostat, would be like a thermometer, right? Something that is measuring the temperature in the environment. And that's usually has a set point. And what a set point is kind of like that's where you want the normal limit to be. And so in the case of the thermostat, we're going to have the temperature set at a set point, usually around 20, 22 degrees Celsius, thereabouts. And so if the temperature in the room or your house goes outside of those limits, then we have our integrator or our control center, which is the thermostat, that is going to relay information to our effector. In this case, the effector would be your heater, whether it's a furnace or baseboard heaters, whatever, right? So the stimulus is going to be that dropping room temperature, and the response, of course, to that stimulus is going to be that your heater is going to turn on, right? And so you're going to take something where there's an imbalance in a situation, and you're going to restore balance by adjusting the effector. Okay, so as the room temperature rises, we restore that balance, and then that relays information back to our sensor that's going to relate that to our thermostat to, again, just stop adjusting or increasing the heat, and on and on and on. So let's bring this into the context of biology, right? So in biology, I think a good example of this is if you're performing exercise, if you're doing vigorous exercise, then what's going to happen is you're going to want to draw oxygen into your bloodstream, but you're also going to want to expel the vast amounts of carbon dioxide produced as your body tries to break down glucose as a fuel source to gain energy. Right? So, so the CO2 levels actually that are increasing during exercise are going to stimulate receptors in your brain stem. Okay. Now, as a result of that, those receptors in your brain stem, they're nerve cells, and they're going to carry impulses from that part of your brain to your muscles. So your nerve cells are acting as integrators or coordinators in a sense. And so as a result of that, your muscles are going to stimulate, of your diaphragm specifically, are going to stimulate an increase in your breathing rate, right? So that's going to be the response that you get as a result of the CO2 levels kind of going outside the normal limits. Okay, so the stimulus is the CO2 levels increasing, and the response to that is to cause your diaphragm muscles to, and you know, the muscles of your heart are going to go along with that to circulate blood at a faster rate, and so on and so forth. But all of these are going to work together to expel that extra CO2, to get extra O2 into your bloodstream, which as a reactant in cellular respiration will give you the energy that you need in the breaking down of glucose. So what we've really been talking about here is a feedback mechanism or a feedback loop. And so negative feedback loops are the ones that are going to kind of try to counteract any kind of changes and bring them back to a normal state. That's why they're called negative feedback loops, because something is going out of bounds and we want to negate that change. So if we look at this in sort of as a flow chart, we're looking to bring a change caused by a stimulus that's resulted in a change moving outside a set point back to that set point. So our sensor is going to relay information to our integrator, to our effector, and that's going to cause a response, and eventually that's going to feed back to our sensor that things are no longer a problem, and that's going to stop the process of change caused by our effector. So most homeostatic mechanisms are going to operate on this principle. We saw that with the breathing rate. As soon as the O2 levels are going to go up, then our CO2 levels are also going to be going down as we breathe faster to expel it. And that's going to indicate to our effector to stop functioning to increase our breathing rate. So if we were to visualize this on a graph, you know, we would see our set point as being the standard point right here. So if we're talking about a thermostat, maybe that set point is 20 degrees Celsius, right? And if we see a deviation from that set point, so in other words, the temperature in the room goes above where we would like it to be, above the set point, then there's going to be some kind of corrective action. So maybe either your heater turns off or your air conditioner turns on until you reach set point again. And again, we can also see the set point going below the acceptable limit, and then we see corrective action bringing it back to that set point, and so on and so forth. So again, this is an example of what happens during a negative feedback loop. So then what is a positive feedback mechanism, and what's the point of it? Well, a positive feedback mechanism isn't looking to bring you back to a set point. It's looking to amplify a particular response. And so this is far less common and usually serves to accomplish a particular task. Right? So it's not something that's happening regularly, but usually just to accomplish a specific task. So a couple of good examples of this are childbirth and lactation. I'm going to start with childbirth. So, you know, when the baby reaches a certain age, as it's growing, then what happens is the head will sort of, and the parts of the baby will push against the walls of the uterus, right? And that will secrete, cause the brain to stimulate the release of a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin gets carried to the bloodstream, into the bloodstream to the uterus, and that starts contractions. But as soon as those small contractions happen, that stimulates more oxytocin to be released from the pituitary gland, which really results in greater contractions. On and on and on, more and more oxytocin being released, amplifying the change, and eventually causing that baby to push against the cervix and just be born. So that's one example. So that's to accomplish a very specific task, the task of birthing that baby. Now, once the baby is born, you know, during breastfeeding, the baby will suckle on the mother's breast, and what will happen as a result of that, just that suckling itself, signals the brain, the pituitary, to release a couple of different hormones, the prolactin, which is responsible for milk production, and oxytocin, which is responsible for milk ejection. So the more the baby suckles, the more milk gets produced. And so you can imagine as a baby is growing that its milk requirement, its nutritional requirements increase. And so the act of suckling more frequently results in more milk actually being produced and released. In fact, this positive feedback loop is so effective that many women will claim, and I challenge you to find the research on this because there's lots of it, many women will claim that simply hearing a baby's cry will stimulate milk production, and they'll actually be leaking milk simply from hearing the baby cry. Pretty amazing evolutionary response. So blood clotting is also another example of positive feedback, right, where we're amplifying a response simply by the response itself. So when we look at this, at the example of blood clotting, let's say that you have some kind of a breakage or a tear in your blood vessel and that causes bleeding. Well, that immediately will initiate a positive feedback loop where platelets will be sent to adhere to the site and start to release chemicals to create that sort of net to block further blood from escaping. So the result of the platelets simply being present and releasing those chemicals actually amplifies the situation, and that sends out a message to these platelets in the bloodstream, come on, we need to come and solve this problem. And so that will amplify the feedback and will actually clot the blood faster. So there are a few examples of positive feedback, but remember those are usually to accomplish a single task, not looking to bring things back to a set point, but to amplify a situation. So you may want to write out this note just to simply have to remind you of the details of it. And so in class tomorrow, make sure that you keep any questions that you have written down somewhere so we can address them, and make sure to clarify anything that seems unclear to you. Hopefully we will see you tomorrow.